There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the plain clothes of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, and offer no warning that they are, in fact, the architects of everything that comes after. They are the hinges upon which your world will swing open into a room you never knew existed. For me, that moment smelled like old books and Liam's laundry detergent, a scent I had long ago cataloged as the smell of home. He was standing in the doorway of my bedroom, silhouetted against the weak yellow light of the hallway, a perfect study in tension and shadow. He had been hovering there for a full minute, a ship caught between the pull of two different tides, and I had been pretending to read, the words on the page dissolving into meaningless shapes as I tracked his indecision in my periphery. He had started to say something, the sentence beginning with a low rumble in his chest, a hesitant, "Leo, I have to tell you something." And then, nothing. The words had died on his lips, caught in the space between his intention and his fear. And in that silence, I felt the entire structure of our friendship, a thing I had carefully built and maintained for 8 years, begin to groan under a new and unfamiliar weight. He finally moved, stepping not forward into the room, but back, as if to retreat. Then he stopped, his shoulders slumping in a gesture of such profound defeat that it ached in my own bones. He scrubbed a hand over his face, a gesture I knew meant he was warring with himself, running diagnostics on a problem whose parameters he couldn't define. He looked at me, his eyes, usually so bright with an easy, uncomplicated confidence, were clouded with something I couldn't name. It was a vulnerability so raw and unguarded that I felt like an intruder for witnessing it. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the weight of the unspoken thing, the ghost of a confession that now haunted the space between us. I held my breath, my heart a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs, waiting for the blow or the blessing, uncertain which one would be worse. He took a single, decisive step forward, closing half the distance between the door and my bed. My muscles tensed. This was it. The foundation would either crack or hold. But instead of speaking, he just kept walking until he was standing beside my bed, looking down at me. Then, with a sigh that seemed to drain all the fight from his body, he leaned down, wrapped his arms around my shoulders, and pulled me into a hug. It wasn't our usual hug, the quick, back-patting gesture of casual affection between friends. This was different. This was an anchor dropping in a storm. He held on, his face buried in the crook of my neck, his breathing unsteady, and I could feel the frantic, desperate pulse of his heart against my own. He was holding on as if I were the only solid thing in a world that had turned to water. And as I slowly, tentatively, brought my own arms up to hold him back, I understood that the unsaid thing hadn't vanished. It had simply changed form, transforming from a collection of words into the desperate, crushing pressure of his embrace. He had chickened out, yes, but in doing so, he had confessed everything. To understand the weight of that hug, you have to understand the architecture of our friendship. Liam and I were a study in complementary opposites, a truth that had been apparent from the day we were assigned as freshman roommates. He was all bright surfaces and forward momentum, a software engineer who saw the world as a series of logical problems to be solved, his life a clean, elegant code he was constantly refining. He moved through the world with an effortless grace that drew people in, collecting friends and experiences like a ship collecting barnacles, each one a testament to his journey. I, on the other hand, was a creature of quiet spaces and careful observation. As a photographer, my native language was light and shadow, the subtle shift in an expression, the story told in the negative space around a subject. I lived in the pauses, in the moments between the action, finding meaning not in what was said, but in what was left unspoken. Our room was a perfect microcosm of our dynamic. His side was a controlled chaos of tech gadgets, running shoes, and half-finished coding projects scrawled on a whiteboard. Mine was a sanctuary of curated stillness, stacks of photography books arranged by color, a single healthy plant on the windowsill, my camera equipment laid out with surgical precision. We should have clashed. We should have been two weather systems colliding, but instead, we found a strange and immediate equilibrium. He filled my silences, and I anchored his energy. He would burst into the room, vibrating with the success of a debugged program or the thrill of a last-minute goal in a pickup soccer game. And I would listen, a quiet harbor for his boundless enthusiasm. I would spend hours in the darkroom, lost in the alchemical process of coaxing images from silver and light, and emerge blinking into the world to find he'd left a plate of food for me, knowing I'd forget to eat. He taught me how to talk to strangers without feeling like my skin was inside out, and I taught him how to sit still, how to simply be in a space without needing to fill it with noise or action. We were two sides of a single coin, and the friendship that grew between us was the most stable, most essential structure in my life. It was a home I had built, brick by careful brick, and I guarded its walls with a quiet ferocity. There was, of course, a complication. A hidden room in that house that only I knew about. I had fallen in love with him somewhere in the blur of our sophomore year. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic event. It was a slow, creeping dawn. It was the way the late afternoon sun would catch the gold flecks in his brown eyes as he laughed at something I'd said. It was the unconscious way he'd nudge his foot against mine under a table at the dining hall, a small, constant point of contact. It was watching him sleep, his face stripped of its usual confident mask, looking young and vulnerable in the moonlight filtering through our dorm window. It was 1,000 tiny, insignificant moments that, when stitched together, created a tapestry so vast and undeniable it took my breath away. And it terrified me, because Liam was, for all intents and purposes, straight. His life was a clear and linear path, and on that path were girlfriends. There was Jessica in freshman year, a whirlwind of nervous energy. There was Chloe in junior year, an art history major who was sharper and funnier than anyone I'd ever met. And then, after graduation, there was Sarah. Sarah was different. She was calm and kind, and she loved him in a way that felt steady and real. She fit into his life, into the elegant code he was writing for himself. And watching them together was a unique and exquisite form of torture. It was like looking through a window into a warm, well-lit room while standing outside in the cold. I learned to live with the ache. I perfected the art of being the supportive best friend. I gave him advice, listened to his frustrations, and celebrated his happiness, all while carefully policing the borders of my own heart. I packed my feelings away into a small, locked box and buried it so deep inside myself that most days, I could almost forget it was there. My love for him became a part of my internal landscape, a quiet, melancholic hum beneath the surface of my life, a secret I was certain I would carry to my grave. The friendship was too precious, too vital, to risk on the impossible chance that he could ever see me as anything more than the quiet, steady presence in the corner of his life. The shift began on a Tuesday in October. Autumn had arrived in full force, stripping the trees bare and painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray. Liam had been with Sarah for nearly 3 years, and from my vantage point, their relationship had seemed to be settling into the comfortable, predictable rhythms of long-term commitment. They had a shared language of inside jokes, a cat they co-parented, and a favorite Thai restaurant they ordered from every Friday. It was a life fully formed. So when Liam came home that evening, his face pale and his movements stiff, as if his joints had suddenly rusted over, I assumed he'd had a bad day at work. He dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door with a clatter that sounded too loud in the quiet apartment, and walked into the living room without saying a word. He sank onto the couch, the springs groaning in protest, and stared at the blank television screen. I waited. I had learned over the years that Liam processed his turmoil externally, but he needed time to let the pressure build before he could release it. I made a pot of tea, the familiar ritual a small, comforting anchor in the sudden, tense atmosphere. I placed a mug on the coffee table in front of him, the steam rising in a fragile column. He didn't seem to notice. His gaze was fixed on something 1,000 miles away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of charged silence, he spoke, his voice a rough, broken thing. She left, just 2 words. But they landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. I sat down in the armchair opposite him, keeping a careful distance, giving him space to breathe. "Sarah?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He nodded, a single, jerky movement. He still hadn't looked at me. He was staring at the reflection of our lamp in the dark screen, a lonely point of light in an endless void. He started to talk, the words spilling out in a disjointed, halting rush. It wasn't a dramatic breakup, which somehow made it worse. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no single, catastrophic betrayal. It was a quiet erosion. She had sat him down, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and told him, in a voice that was both gentle and unbearably final, that she didn't feel like she was truly seen by him. She said he was a good man, the best man she knew, but that some essential part of him was always held in reserve, a room in his own house that he kept locked. She felt she was living with a beautiful, kind, and generous ghost. She loved him, but she couldn't spend the rest of her life trying to solve a puzzle that he refused to acknowledge even existed. He recounted her words with a clinical, detached precision, as if he were debugging a piece of code, searching for the single line that had caused the entire system to crash. He didn't seem angry or even particularly sad. He just seemed hollowed out, confused. He couldn't understand it. He had done everything right, followed all the logical steps. He had been a good boyfriend. He had remembered her birthday, tolerated her terrible taste in music, and learned how to make her favorite pasta dish. He had performed all the functions of a loving partner. Where was the flaw in the logic? As I listened, a cold, terrible feeling began to bloom in my chest. It was a complex and shameful mix of profound sympathy for his pain and a selfish, horrifying flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope. Her words, a room in his own house that he kept locked, echoed in my mind. I knew that room. I had been standing outside its door for years. That night was the beginning of the ritual. After he had talked himself into an exhausted silence, we put on a movie, an old action film we'd both seen a dozen times. It was a mindless, comforting noise to fill the cavernous silence that Sarah's absence had created. He stretched out on the long couch, and I took the armchair. But as the movie wore on, the exhaustion of the day pulled him under. His breathing deepened, and his head lolled to the side. I watched him for a while, the blue light from the screen tracing the sharp line of his jaw and the soft curve of his mouth. He looked younger, the lines of stress and confusion smoothed away by sleep. I got up, turned off the television, and gently draped a throw blanket over him. It felt like a transgression, this small act of care. I retreated to my room, leaving my door slightly ajar, a habit I developed in college for reasons I never fully articulated to myself. It was a silent invitation, a statement that my space was not entirely closed off from his. I lay in bed, listening to the sound of his soft, even breathing from the other room, and felt the foundations of our carefully constructed world begin to shift beneath my feet. The next night, he suggested the movie, and the night after that. It became our new routine, a silent agreement to not leave him alone with the echoing silence of his own thoughts. For the first week, he slept on the couch, a clear and defined boundary between us. I would be the last one awake, turning off the lights, checking that he was covered, a silent, nocturnal guardian. But then, things began to change, the shifts so subtle at first that I could almost convince myself I was imagining them. One night, instead of taking the whole couch, he sat at one end, leaving the other cushion empty. An invitation. After a moment of internal debate that felt as momentous as a treaty negotiation, I sat down, leaving a careful, deliberate space of at least 2 feet between us. It felt both monumental and ridiculous. We were 2 continents adrift on a sea of upholstery. But as the movie progressed, the gravitational pull of his exhaustion took over. He leaned his head back, and then, slowly, it listed to the side until it came to rest against the top of the couch, inches from my shoulder. I sat ramrod straight, every nerve ending in my body screamingly aware of his proximity. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. I didn't move a muscle for the rest of the film, my body locked in a state of suspended animation, terrified that the slightest movement would break the spell. This became the new phase of the ritual. We would sit on the same couch, a shrinking DMZ between us, and he would fall asleep, his head eventually finding its way to my shoulder. The first time it happened, his head slumping heavily against me, my entire body went rigid. It felt like a brand, a claim. His hair was soft against my cheek, and his breath was a warm, steady puff against my neck. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet room. I was convinced he could hear it, that he could feel the tremor of my anxiety running through my body and into his. But he just slept, a deep, untroubled sleep he hadn't seemed capable of since the breakup. So I sat there, a living statue, my own comfort secondary to the profound, terrifying privilege of being his. I would let my arm fall asleep, endure a cramp in my leg, anything to not disturb him. I was his temporary anchor, and the responsibility of it was both a crushing weight and a breathtaking gift. I began to photograph him in my mind. I memorized the way a stray lock of hair fell across his forehead, the slight flutter of his eyelids in a dream, the way his hand would be loosely curled on his chest. I was documenting the erosion of our boundaries, collecting evidence of a change I didn't dare name. During the day, we would revert to our old, easy friendship. We'd make breakfast, talk about work, joke about the state of the apartment. It was a performance of normalcy, a collective agreement to pretend that the nights weren't happening. We never spoke of it. We never acknowledged the growing intimacy that bloomed in the dark, under the flickering light of the television. It was our secret, unspoken covenant. But the pretense was becoming harder to maintain. The silence around the ritual was growing louder, more charged with meaning. I was living a double life, the platonic best friend by day, and something else entirely by night. Something undefined, something terrifying, something I wanted more than I had ever wanted anything. The boundary dissolved completely on a rainy Thursday about a month after Sarah left. Liam had been quiet all day, lost in a fog of melancholy that the dreary weather only seemed to intensify. That night, we were on the couch, in our usual positions, when he stirred. He didn't wake up, but he shifted in his sleep, turning towards me and slinging an arm across my waist, pulling himself closer until his forehead was pressed against my shoulder and his legs were tangled with mine. He mumbled something incoherent and settled into this new position with a contented sigh. My breath hitched in my throat. This was no longer accidental proximity. This was an embrace. I was holding him. He was holding me. My mind raced, trying to categorize the event, to file it under accidental sleep cuddling, a subgenre of friend helping friend through a tough time. But my body wasn't listening to my frantic rationalizations. My body was singing. Every point of contact was a jolt of electricity, a confirmation of a truth I had been suppressing for years. I could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart through his shirt, and I tried to match my own frantic rhythm to his. I stayed like that for hours, long after the movie had ended and the screen had gone black, just breathing him in, terrified of the dawn that would inevitably come and force us back into our designated roles. A week later, he escalated it again. He came home late from work, looking utterly depleted. The project he was leading had hit a major snag, and he'd spent 12 hours staring at lines of code, trying to find the source of the bug. He bypassed the living room entirely and came straight to my open bedroom door, leaning against the frame. He looked small, stripped of his usual confidence. "Hey," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Mind if I just crash in here tonight? The couch is killing my back." The excuse was so thin it was transparent, but it was the lifeline he needed, the plausible deniability that allowed him to ask for what he really wanted without having to name it. My room wasn't just my room anymore. It had become a sanctuary. It was the quietest place in the apartment, the place where the world couldn't touch him. "Of course," I said, my voice betraying none of the chaos erupting in my chest. I moved my stack of books from the other side of the queen-sized bed, creating a space for him. He nodded his thanks and disappeared to change. When he came back, he was wearing a soft gray t-shirt and pajama pants. He slipped under the covers without a word, turning his back to me, creating a rigid, deliberate wall of space between us. I turned off my reading lamp, plunging the room into darkness, save for the sliver of city light filtering through the blinds. The silence was deafening. I was acutely aware of every tiny sound. The creak of the floorboards in the apartment above, the distant siren wailing down the street, the sound of his breathing, just a few feet away. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, my body as stiff as a board. This was a new and far more dangerous territory. The couch had been a neutral ground, but this was my bed, my most private space. I must have eventually drifted off, because I was woken sometime later by a subtle shift in the mattress. I opened my eyes to find him turned towards me, his face illuminated by a stray beam of moonlight. His eyes were open, and he was just watching me. My heart stopped. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. We just lay there, looking at each other in the silent, silvered dark. I could see the questions in his eyes, the confusion, the deep, aching loneliness that had been his constant companion for weeks. He didn't say anything. He just lifted a hand and gently, tentatively, brushed a strand of hair off my forehead. His fingers were warm against my skin, the touch so feather-light it was barely there, but it sent a shockwave through my entire system. It was a gesture of such profound, unguarded tenderness that it broke through all my defenses. He held his hand there for a moment, his thumb stroking my temple, and then he let it fall away. He rolled back over, his back to me once more, and a few minutes later, his breathing evened out into the steady rhythm of sleep. I, on the other hand, lay awake until dawn, his phantom touch burning on my skin, the unasked question hanging in the air between us like a suspended star, impossibly bright and impossibly far away. The ritual of him sleeping in my bed became the new normal. He always had an excuse. He was too tired to make it to his own room. He had a headache and my room was darker. He'd had a nightmare and didn't want to be alone. The excuses became thinner and thinner until, eventually, he stopped making them at all. He would just appear at my door at the end of the day, a silent question in his eyes, and I would nod, and he would climb into my bed. We rarely touched in those first few weeks. We maintained a careful, respectful distance, two solitary islands in a sea of white cotton sheets. But the gravitational pull of sleep and comfort is a powerful force. Slowly, inevitably, the space between us began to shrink. It started with an accidental brush of his foot against mine, which neither of us acknowledged nor moved away from. Then, one night, I woke up to find his arm thrown over my chest, his hand resting just over my heart, as if he were checking to make sure it was still beating. I lay perfectly still, feeling the gentle rise and fall of his breathing, the weight of his arm a warm, comforting pressure. This was how we slept now, entwined, not as lovers, not yet, but as two people who had found a way to quiet the noise of the world by holding on to each other in the dark. I existed in a state of perpetual, high-stakes analysis. Every gesture, every touch, every sigh was a piece of data that I would turn over and over in my mind, searching for its true meaning. Was this just about his loneliness? Was I just a warm body, a convenient, human-shaped security blanket he was using to get through a hard time? Or was it something more? Was it possible that in the wreckage of his old life, he was discovering something new about himself? Something that involved me? The ambiguity was killing me. The hope was a sweet, sharp poison, and the fear of being wrong, of misinterpreting this desperate need for comfort as something more, was a constant, cold dread in the pit of my stomach. I was living on a knife's edge, suspended between the most beautiful dream and the most devastating reality. I was so focused on cataloging his actions that I failed to notice how much I had changed. I was no longer just the quiet observer. I was an active participant. I had started leaving the light on for him. I bought a new set of softer sheets. I found myself adjusting my own sleep schedule to match his, waiting for the sound of his footsteps in the hall before I could truly relax. He was not just in my bed. He was in my bones, in the very rhythm of my days. The house I had so carefully built around my heart now had a door that was permanently unlocked, and he was the only one with the key. And that brings us back to the moment in the doorway. It was a Tuesday, nearly 3 months after the breakup. The ritual was so established by now that it was no longer a ritual, but simply the way things were. He had been different all day, distracted, restless. He had paced the apartment, picked up his phone only to put it down again, started to say things, and then trailed off. The air around him was buzzing with a nervous energy I hadn't seen in him before. It wasn't the frantic energy of a work problem or the low hum of his usual melancholy. This was something new. It was the energy of a man standing on a precipice, trying to summon the courage to jump. When he appeared in my doorway that night, I knew something was about to break. The tension that had been building between us for months had finally reached its peak. The unspoken things had gathered into a storm cloud that was ready to burst. "Leo, I have to tell you something." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of portent. I braced myself. For what? I didn't know. A confession that he was moving out? An apology for using me as a crutch? A declaration that he'd met someone new? My mind cycled through a dozen devastating possibilities, each one worse than the last. But then came the silence, the retreat, the agonizing hesitation, and finally the hug. As he held me, his arms a steel band around me, his heart hammering against my chest. I finally understood the nature of his energy. It wasn't about work. It wasn't about Sarah. It wasn't about leaving. It was about us. The thing he couldn't say, the confession that had died on his tongue, was the very thing his body was screaming into the hollow of my neck. He was terrified, and in his terror, he had sought the only comfort he knew, the only safety he had left, me. He held me for a long time, and I just held him back, my cheek pressed against his hair, my own fears slowly giving way to a fragile, terrifying wave of understanding. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were glassy, his face etched with a profound and heartbreaking vulnerability. He didn't try to speak again. He just looked at me, 1,000 unsaid words passing between us in the charged silence. Then he turned, walked over to my bed, and pulled back the covers on his side. An invitation. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't about comfort or loneliness. It was a choice. A question. I followed him. I slid into bed beside him, and we lay on our sides, facing each other. The moonlight cut a single, sharp line across the pillow between us, a border we had yet to cross. He reached out, his hand hovering in the space for a moment before he gently cupped my cheek. His thumb stroked my skin, a slow, deliberate movement. His eyes searched mine, and I let him see everything. I let him see the years of carefully hidden affection, the agonizing hope of the past few months, the terror and the certainty that were currently warring inside me. I laid myself bare for him in that silence. His gaze dropped to my lips, and then back to my eyes. His own lips parted slightly, as if he were about to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he leaned in, his movements agonizingly slow, giving me every possible opportunity to pull away, to stop him, to put the walls back up. I didn't move. I met him halfway. The first touch of his lips was impossibly soft. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question, a confession, a sigh of relief. It was hesitant and gentle, a discovery. It was the taste of salt from tears I hadn't realized he'd shed, and the faint, familiar taste of the mint tea we'd had after dinner. It was the culmination of 1,000 unspoken moments, of every late-night conversation, every shared silence, every accidental touch. It was the sound of a lock finally turning, of a door creaking open into a room I had only ever dreamed of. The kiss deepened, but it never lost its tentative, questioning quality. It was a conversation without words, a mapping of new territory. His other hand came up to my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us at all, the moonlight border completely erased. We were no longer two separate entities, but a single, tangled shape in the quiet dark. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His breathing was as unsteady as mine. "Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. It was the only word he said. It was the only word he needed to say. He had finally said my name as if it were the answer to a question he had been asking himself for a very long time. I didn't answer. I just brought my hand up to the back of his neck, my fingers tangling in his soft hair, and held him. We lay like that for the rest of the night, forehead to forehead, our legs entwined, our hands exploring the new and miraculous landscape of each other's bodies in small, reverent gestures. We didn't sleep. We just held on, two people who had finally found their way home, not to a place, but to a person. The sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange, and for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of the dawn. The morning after was a masterpiece of awkward, painful silence. I woke to an empty bed. The indentation of his head was still on the pillow next to me, the sheets on his side still warm, but Liam himself was gone. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. I got up and walked into the living room, my heart pounding a nervous, erratic rhythm. He was there, dressed for work, pouring coffee into a travel mug with a rigid, focused intensity that set my teeth on edge. He didn't look up when I entered. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. "Morning," he replied, his back still to me. His voice was flat, devoid of any of the warmth and emotion from the night before. It was the voice of a polite stranger. He screwed the lid onto his mug, grabbed his laptop bag from the counter, and finally turned to face me. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His gaze was fixed on a point somewhere over my left shoulder. Running late. Got an early meeting. It was a lie. I knew his schedule as well as my own. His first meeting wasn't until 10. The knot in my stomach tightened into a cold, hard stone. Liam, I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. Liam, what was last night? Liam, are you okay? Liam, don't you dare walk out that door and pretend it didn't happen. He cut me off, taking a step towards the door. We'll talk later, he said, the words clipped and dismissive. It was a promise I knew he had no intention of keeping. He was already gone, his mind halfway out the door, building walls as fast as he could. He walked out, closing the doors softly behind him, and the click of the latch echoed in the apartment like a gunshot. I stood alone in the kitchen, the smell of his coffee hanging in the air, and felt the beautiful, fragile room we had built the night before collapse into a pile of dust and rubble around me. The hope that had bloomed so brightly just hours before now felt like the cruelest kind of joke. I had misinterpreted everything. I was just a port in a storm, and the storm had passed, and he was sailing away, leaving me wrecked on the shore. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. Liam became a ghost in our own apartment. He left early, came home late, and when he was home, he was a phantom. He'd hole up in his room with the door closed, or he'd claim he had plans with other friends, people I hadn't heard him mention in months. The nightly ritual was dead. The couch remained empty. My bed was cold. The silence between us was no longer comfortable or charged. It was a gaping, infected wound. He avoided my eyes, answered my questions in monosyllables, and moved around me as if I were a piece of furniture he was trying not to bump into. He was running, not just from me, but from himself. He was desperately trying to shove what had happened between us back into a box, to label it a mistake, an aberration brought on by grief and loneliness. He was trying to rebuild the walls of his old life, the one where everything was simple and logical, where he was straight and I was just his best friend. And I let him. For a week, I let him run. I was hurt, so deeply and profoundly hurt that I couldn't find the words to confront him. My anger was a cold, quiet thing, buried under layers of confusion and a familiar, resigned sadness. I had allowed myself to hope, and this was my punishment. I had broken the cardinal rule. I had wanted more than the friendship he offered. I retreated back into myself, into the quiet, observational role that had always been my default. I watched him from a distance, this man I thought I knew, as he frantically tried to erase the most honest moment we had ever shared. I saw the panic in his eyes when he thought I was about to say something, the deep lines of exhaustion carved around his mouth that had nothing to do with work. He was tearing himself apart, and the worst part was, I was the cause. The breaking point came on a Saturday night. I had just come home from a gallery opening, the smell of cheap wine and intellectual pretense still clinging to my clothes. I found him in the kitchen, staring into the open refrigerator as if the answers to the universe were hidden behind a carton of milk. He looked terrible. He was pale, he'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes that made him look haunted. He didn't hear me come in. I stood in the doorway and watched him, and the cold anger inside me finally melted away, replaced by a wave of unbearable sadness for both of us. We couldn't go on like this. This silent, agonizing dance was destroying the last vestiges of the friendship we had spent 8 years building. I had to know. Even if the answer destroyed me, I had to hear it from him. The ambiguity was a poison, and I needed the antidote, or I needed to let it finish me off. We need to talk, Liam. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a knife. He flinched, his whole body going rigid. He slowly closed the refrigerator door and turned to face me. He looked like a cornered animal. I'm tired, Leo, he said, his voice a low rasp. Can we do this tomorrow? No, I said, and the firmness in my own voice surprised me. We're doing this now. I walked past him and sat down at our small kitchen table, the one where we'd shared hundreds of meals, hundreds of conversations. I motioned to the chair opposite me. He hesitated for a long moment, his internal war playing out across his features. Finally, with a sigh of complete and utter surrender, he sat down. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the wood grain of the table, his hands clenched into tight fists in his lap. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in my hands. What are you so afraid of? I asked, my voice softer now. He didn't answer. He just shook his head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. I pushed on. Are you afraid of me? Or are you afraid of what happened? Or are you just afraid of yourself? He winced at the last question, a direct hit. I waited, letting the silence stretch, refusing to fill it for him this time. This was his silence to break. After what felt like a lifetime, he finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what I'm doing. Leo, he finally looked up at me, and his eyes were swimming with a desperate, frantic confusion that broke my heart. This isn't me. I'm not. I like women. I've always liked women. Sarah, his voice cracked on her name. What happened between us? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't fit. It's like a piece of code from a completely different program got into my system, and it's crashing everything. He scrubbed his hands over his face, the picture of despair. I can't lose you, he whispered. You're my best friend. You're everything. And I feel like I've broken it. I've broken us. And I don't know how to fix it. His confession, when it came, was a torrent of fear and self-loathing. He was terrified that he had just been using me, that his loneliness had twisted his feelings into something they weren't. He was terrified of what people would think. He was terrified of what this meant for his own identity, the neat, orderly life he had planned for himself. He had spent his whole life following a map, and he had suddenly found himself in a country that wasn't on it, speaking a language he didn't understand. And it was clear that the kiss, for him, hadn't been a mistake. It had been a revelation, a terrifying, world-altering revelation, and he was trying with all his might to unsee it. I listened, and as he spoke, my own pain began to recede, replaced by a deep, aching empathy. I had spent so much time analyzing my own feelings, my own fears, that I hadn't truly considered the depth of his. For me, loving him was a fundamental, long-established part of who I was. For him, feeling something for me was a seismic event that threatened to demolish the entire structure of his identity. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his clenched fist. He flinched at my touch, but he didn't pull away. His hand was ice cold. Liam, I said, my voice steady. Look at me. He slowly lifted his gaze to mine. You haven't broken anything. And you weren't using me. I am not that fragile, and you are not that cruel. What happened between us, it happened because it was supposed to. It's been happening for months. Years, maybe. You just finally let yourself see it. I took a breath. It was time to jump off my own cliff. I'm in love with you, Liam. I have been for a very long time. So whatever you're feeling, you're not feeling it alone. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to put a label on it. You just have to stop running. The words settled in the space between us. I had finally said it. The secret I had carried for 8 years was finally out, lying there on the kitchen table between us. I watched as a series of emotions washed over his face. Shock, disbelief, fear, and then, finally, a flicker of something that looked like relief. As if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He finally unclenched his fist under my hand and turned his palm up, his fingers lacing with mine. His skin was still cold, but the simple act of him holding my hand back sent a wave of warmth through me. I'm scared, he whispered, and it was the most honest thing he had said all week. I know, I said, squeezing his hand. Me too. We didn't fix everything that night. There was no magical moment of perfect clarity. But we had stopped the bleeding. We had opened a door for communication, replacing the toxic silence with a fragile, tentative honesty. We talked for hours, not about labels or the future, but about the present, about the fear, about the confusion, and about the undeniable, terrifying, and beautiful thing that had grown between us in the dark. He admitted that being with me, sleeping next to me, felt more like home than anywhere he had ever been. He admitted that the thought of not having that, of going back to the way things were, was unbearable. He admitted that when he kissed me, it hadn't felt wrong or strange. It had felt like an arrival. That night, for the first time in over a week, he came to my room. There was no excuse, no pretense. He stood in the doorway, just as he had on that other night. But this time, there was no hesitation. He looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I nodded, and he walked in, closing the door softly behind him. The sound of the click wasn't an ending this time. It was a beginning. He came to bed, and when he held me, it wasn't with the desperation of a drowning man. It was with the quiet, deliberate intention of a man who had finally, after a long and frightening journey, found his way home. The weeks that followed our confrontation were a process of careful, deliberate reconstruction. We were architects of a new kind of relationship, and we had to learn the language of our new world. There were no grand romantic gestures or dramatic declarations. Instead, our progress was measured in small, quiet moments of intentionality. It was Liam making coffee for both of us in the morning and placing my mug, just the way I liked it, next to my laptop. It was me reaching for his hand as we walked down the street, and the way his fingers would instinctively, immediately, curl around mine. It was the end of plausible deniability. The nightly ritual was no longer a ritual born of need and confusion. It was a conscious choice. He didn't sleep in my bed because he was lonely. He slept there because he wanted to be with me. The unspoken tension that had once filled the silences was replaced by a comfortable, easy peace. We were learning to simply be together, without the need for excuses or analysis. There were still moments of fear, of course, moments of awkwardness. We were navigating a landscape for which neither of us had a map. I would catch him sometimes, staring into space with a familiar, troubled look in his eyes, and I knew he was wrestling with the ghost of the man he thought he was supposed to be. But now, instead of retreating, he would talk about it. He would voice his anxieties, his confusion about how to reconcile his past with this new, unexpected present. And I would listen, not with answers, but with reassurance. I would remind him that identity wasn't a fixed, immutable thing, but a fluid, evolving story. We were not destroying his old life. We were simply writing a new, more honest chapter. My role shifted from quiet observer to active partner, a safe harbor where he could anchor his fears without judgment. The biggest change was in the small, domestic intimacies that we had previously skirted around. We started sharing more than just a bed. We shared meals, we shared chores, we shared the quiet, boring, and beautiful minutiae of a life lived together. One Sunday afternoon, I was in the living room, editing a set of photos, when he came and sat on the floor beside my chair, leaning his head against my knee. He didn't say anything. He just closed his eyes and stayed there while I worked, a quiet, solid presence. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was an act of casual, confident affection, an acknowledgement that this, us, was our new normal. I rested my hand on his head, my fingers tracing patterns in his hair, and I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. The constant, low-level anxiety that had been my companion for years, the fear of losing him, had finally, blessedly, gone silent. Our friends, the few who were part of our close-knit circle, noticed the change, but in a way that was surprisingly gentle. There were no dramatic interrogations, just a knowing look from a mutual friend here, a quiet, supportive smile there. It was as if they had all seen something we hadn't, as if our new reality was not a shocking plot twist, but the resolution of a story they had been watching for years. It turned out that the only people who were truly surprised by us were us. One evening, about a month after our talk, I was developing photos in the small darkroom I had set up in a converted closet. The red safe light cast a warm, uterine glow over everything. I was lost in the process, watching an image of a winter landscape slowly emerge in the chemical bath, when I heard a soft knock. Liam opened the door a crack, letting in a sliver of yellow light. "Hey," he whispered. "Can I come in?" I nodded, and he slipped inside, closing the door behind him, plunging us back into the dim, red world. He didn't speak. He just came and stood behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood like that for a long time, watching the photograph come to life in the tray. It was a slow, magical process, watching something invisible become solid and real. "It's beautiful," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "You have to be patient," I said, gently agitating the tray. "You can't rush it. You just have to trust the process. Trust that the image is there, even when you can't see it yet." He tightened his arms around me. "I get that," he said, and his voice was filled with a new kind of understanding. I knew he wasn't just talking about the photograph. He was talking about us. He was talking about the slow, patient, and often frightening process of letting the truth develop in its own time. In the quiet, crimson dark of that room, surrounded by the smell of chemicals and the steady beat of his heart against my back, I felt the last of my own fears dissolve. We were going to be okay. We were more than okay. We were real. We found our home not in a physical space, but in the quiet architecture of the life we built together, in the honest silences and the fearless confessions. The door to my room, once left ajar as a hesitant invitation, was now closed every night, not to shut the world out, but to keep our world in. It was no longer a sanctuary for one, but a shared home for two. We learned that love isn't always a grand, sweeping declaration. Sometimes it's a quiet, patient process of development, an image slowly emerging from the darkness, a truth that was there all along, just waiting for the right light to be seen. And as we lay together in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create, we were no longer defined by the men we thought we were supposed to be, but by the men we had, against all odds, become. Together,